Hi, my name is Anish Desigan. In the past two lessons, we've learned how to import sprites, create objects, add basic events using the drag and drop system, and do some cool things with scrolling and collisions. So I'm going to review what we have built so far, and then we're going to get into what we're going to build in this final lesson. So what we have is a player who can move around in the space and can shoot bullets at enemies, and the enemies will die when they're hit by a bullet. And so the player must navigate around and defeat these enemies, and we're going to do a few things in this lesson. The first is there's this issue we have where we can fire as many bullets as we want very quickly, and what we want instead is to have some sort of delay between those bullets. The next thing we want to do after that is to have the enemies actually move in space based on paths, and have them actually be sort of randomized in their speed and their starting points. So those are the first two things, and the third thing, final thing that we do as a finishing touch to the game is actually add score to the game. So let's begin with the timing of the bullets, and this may actually be the most complex part of the lesson. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to be using variables. So let's go over to our object bullet, and we see that when we collide with an enemy, it's destroyed. And what we want to do is actually, when we go to our player object, we want to create a bullet at a certain cooldown. So after a certain amount of time, we want to be able to create a new bullet. So right now, as we're holding global left down, we create an instance of a bullet. But what we want to do instead is only create that when there is sufficient cooldown. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add an event to the player object that's actually on create, which, if you remember, create happens once at the beginning when the object is first created. So what we're going to do is actually we're going to search for set global, and we're going to see set global variable comes up. We're going to drag that in, and we're going to have a variable. And so what this means is we're going to set a name for a value, and we're going to say that this is a cooldown. And the cooldown is 10 seconds or 10 frames. And what that means is it's not actually 10 seconds, it's 10 frames that the game is playing, which typically is either 1/3 of a second or 1/6 of a second. And so what this is it's setting a name for a value that we can actually change at any time. So we have this value called cooldown, and what we're going to do now is in our global left down, instead of just creating an instance when we have the left mouse button down, we're going to do a check. And what that means is we're going to choose if. We're going to check if variable. So if the variable cooldown, so we're actually going to do global.cooldown because it's a global variable, and this references the variable that we created in create called cooldown. If that variable is less than or equal to 0, then we're going to do something. So if it's less than or equal to 0, we're actually going to create the instance. So right now, it's not actually saying that if we do this, we're going to create the instance. It's saying there's nothing, it's saying empty here. There's nothing that happens if this happens. So we need to attach this create instance to this if block. And the way we do that is we drag this to the right of the if, and now you'll see that the line has shifted. And create instance will only happen if this statement is true. So when is this variable cooldown ever going to reach less than or equal to 0? Right now it's not, because all we're doing is setting it to 10 in the beginning of the game, and it never goes down. So what we need to do instead is decrease that cooldown by 1 every single frame. And so what we're going to do is I'm actually going to copy this, set global variable, and I'm going to go over to the step portion of our logic, and I'm going to paste in. So this step portion happens every single frame, and what we're going to do is we're going to set cooldown to be 1 less than it is, and we're checking relative because it's going to subtract 1 from what it is every single frame. So just to recap, the cooldown starts at 10, every step it goes down by 1, and then if the cooldown is less than or equal to 0, we can create a bullet. However, what's going to happen is that cooldown, the variable cooldown, keeps going down into negatives and becomes negative and negative and negative, and then we're able, after the first 10 frames, to always create bullets. So what we need to do is, when we create a bullet, we have to reset that cooldown. So what we can do is we can paste in what we had with the set global variable. Let's make sure it's under the if and under the create instance. So we're going to, as soon as you create an instance of a bullet, you're also going to reset the cooldown to 10. So now every time you create a bullet, the cooldown is set back to 10, and it has to go all the way back down to 0 before you can create another instance. So let's check this and see if it works. Let's run it. So now I am holding down the mouse button, and it's shooting only once every 10 frames. So if we ever wanted it to be a longer delay between bullets, we can change that value of 10 to something like 30. Or just to make the point, let's make it 100 and see the difference. So now it should only be able to shoot a bullet every 100 frames. So I'm holding down the button, and 100 frames later, we get another shot. So as you can see, this is a great way to do timing of these kind of events. And for now, I'm actually going to prefer 10 as a cooldown, but you can adjust that to whatever you like. The other thing we're going to do now is, in terms of timing, we're going to make sure that the enemies are actually moving. So the next step is to make the enemies move in the scene. And the way we're going to do that is actually with paths. So one idea would be to have the enemy follow the player, but what we're actually going to do instead is just kind of have them move in a predefined path, but randomly along that path. So what I'm going to do is, over on this right side, create a path, and I'm going to call this path_enemy. And we're going to create a path, and what we're going to do is have a smooth curve. We're going to start at the center point, and we're just going to define some points here for how these enemies move. And I'm trying to make it kind of random, and they can kind of move however they wish. And then let's check the closed box, and as you can see, that connects the first point and the last point so that it can actually loop. So now the idea is that basically the enemy will start at some point along this path and follow it and move in this path. So what we're going to do is go back to our enemy object, and we're going to add an event that says on create. This happens at the beginning when the object is created. We're going to look up path, and we're going to say we're going to be able to start following a path. So at the beginning, we're going to start following this path. We drop down and we see the path enemy that we just created. And for now, we're just going to leave the speed 1 and the path action at the end, on end to path action stop. And I'm just going to show you what this looks like. Relative is also set to false, and we're going to see what that does. So as you can see, all these objects are moving in a set path, and and this is actually moving based on the path that I drew in the path editor. So this is good, but what we actually want is it to be a little bit more randomized, because right now all the enemies are moving in the same exact way. So we want them to have different speeds and different starting points, so that it looks much more random. So the first thing I'll say is, on end, we actually want this to be looped so that the enemies never actually stop moving. They just go back to the beginning of that path animation and continue to move. So this speed, we're actually going to do something interesting here and set it to a random number. And the way we can do that is we can type in random and a number in here, and it produces a random number between 0 and that number. So right now I'm going to say that it's going to be a random speed between 0 and 5. So now let's go back and see what happens here. And what happens is every single enemy is moving on this path at a different speed, and it's much more randomized here. So it feels like every enemy is kind of doing its own thing and in its own space. And that's pretty cool. So far we've built this delay on your bullets, and we've built the enemies moving around. The one final thing that we need to do is address the issue of score. We want the player to feel like they're accomplishing something, so we need to have a score displayed in the game. So the first thing we need to do is actually make an object, and we're going to call it obj_score text. And so what we need here is not actually a sprite. We're going to have this object be sort of empty and just create some GUI, which actually stands for graphical user interface. So we're going to create an event that's in draw, and we're going to call it draw GUI, draw GUI. And when we're drawing GUI, what we need to do is we can search draw, and all the drawing things come up, and we want to draw a value. So we draw the value, and we're going to call it score, and then it's going to have a space, and then it's going to give you the value. And right now we don't have anything to display as the score, so I'm just going to put in the value of 15, for example. And we're going to put this in the x coordinate of, actually, we're going to put it at 512, which is halfway, and in the y, we're going to put it at 100, which is slightly from the top. And so let's play this game and see where this actually shows up. Or actually, I have not actually added the object to the scene yet. So I need to drag in this object score text to the scene, and now it'll actually be there. So as you can see, the text score 15 shows up, and because we did it as a graphical user interface object draw, it stays there even if you are moving and scrolling through the scene, the room. So that's pretty cool. We have to actually make a score as a notion now, and what we need to do to make that true is to have another global variable. And so what we're going to do is inside the bullet object, or actually inside the player object, we're going to have in the create step, we're going to set another global variable. So I just copy and pasted that one using Control-C, Control-V, and we're going to call it my score. And so I called it my score, and we're going to set it to 0 in the beginning. Now we can reference this score anywhere and change it. So what we're going to do is inside your bullet object, when you collide with an enemy, we're going to add to the score. So we're going to paste in the set global variable, or you can search in here for set global, and it's here. And we're going to take the my score global variable, and we're going to set it to a value of +1 by basically checking this relative box, and it's going to add 1 to the global variable my score every time a bullet hits an enemy. So now the score goes up by 1 every single time a bullet hits an enemy. And what we can do then, finally, the final step is to actually have the score text display that value. So instead of 15 here, we're going to go and type in global.myscore, and it'll actually auto-complete it for you here. So global.myscore will now show you the score at any given time. And every time you kill an enemy, you will add 1 to your score. So let's look at how that works. So we have a score of 0 in the beginning, and then as I kill an enemy, it goes up to 1, and I can kill more enemies if I can aim here. And you can see the score goes up every single time you kill one enemy. So I'm at score 7 now, score 9. And so this is just pretty much a complete game now. And the way you lose is to actually run into one of these enemies. And so it's pretty cool. And every time you play, it's actually different because it's randomizing the speed of the path animation. So that's a pretty cool game. And the one final thing is, how do you change the font of the score? So we're going to go over to font on the right here and create a font. We're going to call it font_score. And I really like this Arial text, and I want it to be bold, and I want it to be size 20, 24, and that's pretty cool. So now what we just need to do is, in our draw GUI of this draw value, we're going to say we're going to search text, and we're going to find set font. So we're going to set the font to font score, and then we're also going to set the text alignment to, instead of left and top, we're going to set it to center middle. And then if you really want to get into styling, you can do things like draw the color. So you can set the draw color to, let's say, some sort of blue here. So now we are going to play the game, and we should see a blue, larger font of the score at the top, a bolded Arial font. There you go. So score 0. And then as we kill some monsters, we have the score go up. So that is pretty much the end of the lesson. You can definitely do a lot more with GameMaker, but this should give you a pretty good idea of how to get started with the drag and drop interface that GameMaker provides. And it's a really, really good way to quickly and easily make games without any coding knowledge and just a good sense of how logic works. So that is the end of the lesson, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.